The lace was the first thing to betray her. It snagged on the jagged teeth of a pine branch, tearing with a sound like a startled gasp. Clara pulled free, leaving a ghostly white scrap fluttering in the wind. A tiny flag of surrender she could not afford. Each step was a battle. Her satin slippers, meant for a polished aisle, now soaked and useless against the deepening snow. The cold was a physical thing, a predator that gnawed at her bones and stole the breath from her lungs. Just hours ago, she had been a bride. She had stood before a long mirror in her father's house, a vision in ivory silk and Belgian lace. Her reflection a stranger with haunted eyes. Her father, Governor Thompson, had stood behind her, his hands on her shoulders, his grip feeling less like a father's pride and more like a jailer's claim. "Silas is waiting with the carriage," he had said, his voice smooth as polished granite. "Mr. Abernathy is a powerful man. Clara, this union secures our future, your future." Her future, a gilded cage, married to a railroad baron 3 times her age, a man whose touch made her skin crawl, whose breath smelled of stale cigars and entitlement. All for ambition, all for the glint of power in her father's eyes. But Silas, the old driver with kind, watery eyes who had known her since she was a girl, had seen the silent panic in her face when they were out of sight of the sprawling estate. He had taken a different turn, away from the church, away from town, toward the vast, unforgiving wilderness of the Montana Territory. Heard tell of a stagecoach that passes through Willow Creek. "Miss," he'd whispered, not looking back at her. "It heads west, far west. You just get on it and do not look back." He had pressed a small, heavy purse into her hand. It was his life savings. The thought of it burned in her pocket now, a small, hot coal of guilt. The memory splintered as the carriage lurched violently. There was a horrifying crack of wood, the terrified scream of a horse, and then the world tumbled into a chaos of white and black. When stillness returned, it was absolute. Clara was wedged against the door. The fine silk of her dress ripped at the shoulder. The air was thick with the scent of pine and something metallic, blood. "Silas!" she called out, her voice a thin, reedy thing. She pushed her way out of the broken carriage. The scene was one of brutal finality. The carriage lay on its side, one wheel shattered, a splintered wreck against a thick copse of aspen. One of the horses was gone, vanished into the storm. The other lay on the ground, its leg bent at an unnatural angle, its dark eyes wide with a terror that was quickly glazing over. And Silas, he had been thrown clear. He was slumped against a snow-dusted boulder, his head lolling to one side, a dark stain spreading from beneath his worn coat into the pristine snow. A wave of nausea and grief washed over her. She stumbled to his side, her frozen fingers fumbling for a pulse at his neck. There was nothing, just cold, still flesh. He was gone. The weight of it settled on her, heavier than the snow-laden sky. She was alone, truly and utterly alone. For a long while, she just stood there, the wind whipping the fine lace of her veil across her face, freezing the tears to her cheeks. Panic was a wild animal clawing at her throat, but she shoved it down. Panic was a luxury. Panic would kill her. She took the heavy purse from her pocket and secured it in the bodice of her dress. She took the thick wool blanket from the carriage seat and wrapped it tight around her shoulders. Then, with one last sorrowful look at the man who had given his life for her freedom, she turned and walked into the unending whiteness. The world shrank to the circle of her own misery. There was no sun, only a flat gray light that seemed to bleach all color from the landscape. The trees were skeletal figures draped in white, their branches reaching like accusing fingers. Snow fell in a relentless, silent curtain, erasing her tracks almost as soon as she made them. The silence was the worst part. It was a living entity, broken only by the shriek of the wind and the frantic, ragged sound of her own breathing. Her body, softened by a life of comfort, began to fail her. The cold was no longer a sensation but a part of her, a deep, internal ache that settled in her marrow. Her feet were the first to go numb, the elegant slippers offering no protection. Soon she could not feel them at all, and she stumbled often, her heavy, wet dress dragging her down like an anchor. Her shivering became uncontrollable, violent spasms that shook her entire frame. Hunger was a dull, persistent cramp in her belly. She tried to eat snow, but it only made her colder, a searing burn in her mouth and throat. She did not know how long she walked. Hours bled into a timeless eternity of gray and white. Her mind began to play tricks on her. She saw the glittering chandeliers of the ballroom where she was supposed to celebrate her union with Mr. Abernathy. She heard the sound of her mother's piano, a sweet, sad melody from a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. She spoke to Silas, apologizing over and over, her words swallowed by the wind. She was dying. The thought came to her not with fear, but with a strange, detached calm. At least she would die free. It was then, as her vision began to blur and the world tilted on its axis, that she saw it, a dark shape, almost lost in the swirl of snow. It was low to the ground, a smudge of black against the endless white. Smoke. A thin, gray tendril of smoke curled from a stone chimney. A fragile ribbon of life in a world of death. A cabin. Hope, sharp and painful, lanced through her exhaustion. She fixed her eyes on that wisp of smoke and forced her unfeeling legs to move. It was farther than it looked. Each step was an agony. The snow was deeper here, drifting against the trees, and she had to fight for every inch. The cabin grew slowly, resolving itself from the storm. It was a rugged, brutal-looking place, built of thick, dark logs, half of it charred black as if it had survived a fire. It was nearly buried in snow, hunkered down against the wind like a wounded animal that had crawled away to die. There were no windows on the side facing her, only a solid wall of wood and a low, sloping roof heavy with snow. She stumbled into a small clearing and saw the door. It was made of thick, rough-hewn planks. There was no path leading to it, only the unbroken blanket of snow. For a moment, she wondered if it was abandoned, the smoke a figment of her dying imagination. But she had to try. She had to. She reached the door and raised a hand that felt like a club of ice, banging it weakly against the wood. The sound was pathetic, swallowed by the storm. She tried again, putting all her remaining strength into it. "Hello!" she cried, her voice cracking. "Please, is anyone there? Please help me!" There was a long silence. She was about to collapse, to simply lie down and let the snow take her, when she heard a sound from within. A scraping, uneven sound. The heavy thud of a wooden bar being lifted. The door groaned open a few inches, revealing a sliver of darkness and the wary eye of a man. He was not what she expected. He was gaunt, his face all sharp angles and hollows, covered in a rough, dark beard. His hair was long and unkempt, falling over a brow furrowed with suspicion. But it was his eyes that held her. They were a pale, piercing gray, and they held no warmth, only a deep, weary bitterness that seemed as old as the mountains. "What do you want?" he rasped, his voice rough from disuse. Clara leaned against the doorframe, the blanket clutched around her. "Please," she whispered, the words frosting in the air. "My carriage. It crashed. I am lost. Please, I just need a place to get warm, just for a little while." He looked her up and down, his gaze lingering on the tattered remains of her wedding dress peeking from beneath the blanket. Contempt flickered in his eyes. "There is no town for 30 miles. No roads lead here. You are lying." "I am not," she insisted, her voice trembling. "The driver. He knew a back way. We were heading for Willow Creek." "There is nothing in Willow Creek but a burned-out trading post and ghosts," he said, his voice flat. He started to close the door. Desperation gave her a final surge of strength. She thrust her foot, numb as it was, into the opening. No, please, you cannot just leave me out here to die. Her composure finally broke, and a sob tore from her throat. I will not cause any trouble. I will leave as soon as the storm passes. I just need one night. I am so cold. He stared at her, his face an unreadable mask of stone. The wind howled, whipping a sheet of snow into the opening, stinging her face. She could feel the last of her strength ebbing away, the darkness at the edge of her vision creeping in. The world began to spin, the man's hard face dissolving into a blur. Please, she breathed, and then her legs gave out from under her. She collapsed forward, falling into the darkness of the cabin doorway. For a moment, she felt nothing. Then strong arms were around her, lifting her with a grunt of effort. She was being carried. There was a brief, jarring pain as he shifted his weight, accompanied by a muffled curse. She felt the incredible, shocking warmth of a fire on her skin. And then she was being lowered gently onto a rough wooden floor. Consciousness came and went in waves. She was aware of him moving around her, his steps uneven, a limp in his gait. She heard him stoking the fire, the crackle and pop of the flames, a symphony of life. He pulled the sodden blanket from her shoulders. Then he knelt beside her, his presence large and intimidating. She felt him tugging at her feet. She tried to pull away, a weak, instinctual motion. "Stay still," he commanded, his voice less harsh now, more resigned. "Your boots are frozen to you. I have to cut them off." She felt the cold steel of a knife slide between the ruined satin and her skin. He was careful, his movements precise and economical. He worked in silence, cutting away the frozen slippers and the stockings beneath them. Her feet were a horrifying sight, waxy and white, with angry red patches of frostbite. He swore under his breath. He disappeared and came back with a basin of snow. "This is going to hurt," he warned her. He began to rub her feet, gently at first, then with more pressure, the friction of the snow creating a painful, burning sensation. She cried out, a thin, weak sound. "I know," he said, his voice quiet. "It is the only way." He did the same for her hands, which were just as bad. The pain was excruciating, 1,000 needles of fire stabbing into her, but it was a sign of life, of feeling returning. When he was done, he wrapped her hands and feet in clean, dry rags. He pushed a tin cup of something hot and bitter into her hands. It tasted of herbs and bark, but it was warm, and the heat spread through her chest like a benediction. She looked around the cabin for the first time. It was a single, large room, stark and bare. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, the flames casting flickering shadows. There was a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, a narrow cot in the corner, and shelves holding a few tins and sacks of flour. The back wall was blackened timber, the ceiling above it missing in places, covered over with a patchwork of canvas and animal hides. It was the home of a man with nothing left to lose. And the man himself, he sat in the chair opposite the fire, watching her. Wes Calder. She would later learn his name was... He was cleaning his knife with a slow, deliberate motion, the firelight glinting off the steel. He was a man wrapped in a profound solitude, and she had just torn it open. The wind howled outside, rattling the very logs of the cabin. The sound was monstrous, a wild thing trying to claw its way in. "Who is chasing you?" he asked, his voice low and direct. Clara flinched. She looked down at the rags on her hands. "No one." People do not end up in the middle of nowhere, in the worst storm of the season, dressed for a wedding, unless they are running from something, or someone. He wasn't accusing, just stating a fact. I could not go through with it," she said, the partial truth feeling like a lie. "The marriage, it was not right." She did not mention her father's name. She did not mention Mr. Abernathy. To speak their names here, in this raw and quiet place, felt like a desecration. It felt like inviting the world she had fled to come crashing through the door. He did not press her. He just nodded slowly. his gray eyes fixed on the fire. He seemed to be wrestling with some thought of his own. She could see the deep lines etched around his eyes, the tension in his jaw. This man was familiar with trauma. He could sense it on her like a scent on the wind. They sat in silence for a long time. The only sounds the crackling of the fire and the screaming of the wind. Exhaustion finally overtook her, a heavy, pulling tide. Her eyelids drooped. She curled up on the bearskin rug he had laid before the hearth, the warmth a dizzying comfort. Her last thought before sleep claimed her was of the stranger watching her from his chair. A silent, brooding guardian in a world gone white. She woke to the smell of coffee in the flat, gray light of morning. The storm had not abated. If anything, it was worse. The wind was a constant, high-pitched moan, and through the small, grimy window, she could see nothing but a churning vortex of snow. Her host, Wes, was standing by the fire, pouring coffee into a tin cup. He moved with a pronounced limp, his left leg stiff and uncooperative. He seemed to ignore the pain, but she could see the effort it cost him in the tight set of his shoulders. He glanced over and saw she was awake. "There is coffee," he said, gesturing with the pot. He did not offer to get it for her. Clara pushed herself up. Every muscle in her body ached. Her hands and feet throbbed with a dull, persistent pain, but the frightening numbness was gone. She slowly, carefully, made her way to the fireplace and poured a cup for herself. It was black and strong, and she drank it gratefully. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for taking me in. I should go now." He gave a short, harsh laugh. "Go where? You would not make it 10 feet. He nodded toward the window. "That is a blizzard. Could last for days. You are not going anywhere." The finality in his voice sent a fresh wave of despair through her. Trapped. She had escaped one prison only to find herself in another, smaller one. A prison with a single, armed guard. "I cannot stay here," she said, more to herself than to him. "You have no choice," he stated, his voice devoid of sympathy. "But if you are staying in my cabin, you will follow my rules." She looked at him, her chin held high despite the circumstances. "What rules?" He took a slow sip of his coffee, his gray eyes pinning her in place. 1. You will pull your weight. Chop wood, haul water, cook, clean. I am not your servant. 2. You will not ask questions about me, about this cabin, or about what happened to that wall. He gestured to the charred half of the room. My past is my own. 3. You stay out of my way. It was a cold, hard bargain, but she was in no position to refuse. She was alive because of him. She owed him that much. "I agree," she said, her voice steady. He nodded once, as if the matter was settled. He finished his coffee and picked up a heavy axe from beside the door. "The woodpile is low. There is a smaller axe you can use for kindling." Without another word, he opened the door and disappeared into the swirling white chaos, leaving her alone in the tense, quiet warmth of the cabin. Clara stood by the fire, the tin cup warm in her hands, and watched the snow blow past the open doorway. She was trapped with a stranger, a gruff, limping man with a bitter soul and a violent past etched onto his home. There was a dangerous tension between them, a curiosity that neither of them dared to acknowledge. Outside, the world had disappeared. Inside, there was only the fire, the silence, and the two of them, suspended in the heart of the storm. The blizzard was not a storm, it was a siege. For 2 days, it raged with a primal fury, a howling, shrieking whiteness that erased the world. On the 3rd day, the howling subsided into a low, mournful moan, but the snow did not stop. It fell in a thick, endless curtain, burying the cabin deeper, sealing them in a silent, frozen tomb. The small window became a useless patch of gray. Then a solid wall of white. The world outside ceased to exist. Days lost their names. bleeding one into the next, measured only by the level of coffee in the tin, the dwindling stack of firewood, and the growing ache of hunger in their bellies. Time became a thick, slow-moving river of gray light and long, fire-lit darkness. The cabin, which had at first seemed a sanctuary, began to feel like a cage, its log walls closing in on them. The silence between them in those first days was as heavy as the snow on the roof. They moved around each other with the careful, deliberate motions of strangers sharing a prison cell. Wes was a creature of grim routine. He would wake before the light, stoke the fire, and perform his silent inventory of their supplies. A handful of flour, a side of bacon, a sack of dried beans, a small bag of salt. It was a bleak accounting. "We ration," he announced on the fourth day, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. He portioned out a single strip of bacon and 2 hard biscuits for each of them. It was a meager meal that did little to quiet the gnawing emptiness in Clara's stomach, but she ate it without complaint. She understood the cold arithmetic of survival. She began to make herself useful, driven by his rules and by a deeper need to not be a burden. She started with his clothes. His only spare shirt was ripped at the elbow and missing 2 buttons. Using a small sewing kit she found in a dusty crate, a remnant of another life, a woman's life, she meticulously mended the tear with small, even stitches. She found 2 mismatched buttons in the bottom of the kit and sewed them on. When she was done, she folded it and left it on the edge of his cot. He did not acknowledge it, but that evening, she saw him run his thumb over the neat line of her stitches, a flicker of something unreadable in his gray eyes. Her world shrank to the size of their shared tasks. She learned the heft of the small axe, her soft hands quickly growing calloused as she split kindling. The rhythmic work was a balm, a way to focus her mind away from the fear and the gnawing uncertainty. She swept the hearth, kept their few utensils clean, and learned to cook their meager rations over the open fire, trying to make the bland food last, to make it taste of something other than despair. She was no longer Clara Thompson, the governor's daughter. She was just Clara, a woman fighting to stay warm. On the 7th day, the firewood ran out. The last log was placed on the fire, and they both watched it burn. A silent, shared dread settling between them. The cold was already seeping in, a palpable presence. "The chair," Wes said, his voice flat. He nodded toward one of the 2 simple, hand-carved chairs at the table. It was scarred and worn, but sturdy. Clara stared at it. It felt like a violation, like burning a part of the house itself. "Are you sure? Being warm is more important than being comfortable," he said grimly. He took the larger axe, and with a few short, brutal swings, the chair was reduced to a pile of splintered wood. They fed it to the fire piece by piece, hoarding the warmth it gave. The next day, the small table followed. They ate their meals on the floor before the hearth, the axe stripping away another layer of civility, leaving them with something more raw and fundamental. It was in the long, dark evenings that the silence finally began to crack. The fire was their only light, its flickering flames painting their faces in shifting hues of orange and red, softening the hard edges of the room and of the man who inhabited it. One night, while cleaning a small tin box to store their dwindling supply of salt, Clara found a small, worn book of poetry tucked in the back of a shelf. Its leather cover was cracked with age. She opened it carefully. On the inside cover, in elegant, faded ink, was an inscription, "To my dearest Wesley, so we may share the words our hearts cannot speak. Love always, Annabelle." She felt a jolt, a sudden, intense curiosity. It was the first clue she had found to the man behind the gruff, silent exterior. She looked over at him. He was sharpening his knife by the firelight, his movements slow and methodical, his face a mask of concentration. She knew she was breaking one of his rules, but the name echoed in the silence. Annabelle. "She had beautiful handwriting," Clara said softly, her voice barely a whisper. Wes froze. His hand stilled, the knife held motionless over the whetstone. He did not look at her, but his entire body went rigid. The silence stretched, taut and sharp. She thought he would explode in anger, that he would snatch the book from her and cast her out into the snow. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, dangerous rasp. "I told you not to ask questions." "I am sorry," she said quickly, closing the book. "I did not mean to pry. It was just a beautiful inscription." He set the knife down with a deliberate, quiet click. He stared into the flames, his jaw tight. For a long time, he said nothing. Clara held her breath, the small book feeling like a hot brand in her hands. "She was the school teacher," he said at last, his voice rough with an emotion he could not hide. "In town. Her name was Annabelle." He spoke the name as if it were a fragile, precious thing he had not allowed himself to touch in years. "What happened to her?" Clara asked, her voice gentle. He took a deep, shuddering breath. "She was murdered." The words dropped into the quiet cabin like stones into a deep well. "Strangled with her own scarf. They found her in the schoolhouse one morning." A chill that had nothing to do with the cold outside ran down Clara's spine. She watched his face, saw the raw pain that tightened the skin around his eyes. "They blamed me," he continued, his voice flat and devoid of emotion now, as if he were recounting a story that had happened to someone else. "We were to be married. I found her. My hands were the first to touch her. The sheriff, he never liked me, said I had a temper. It was easier to blame the outcast than to find the real killer." He picked up a piece of kindling and tossed it into the fire, watching the sparks fly up. "They held me for a week, never charged me with anything, not enough proof to convict, but that does not matter to folks with their minds made up. When they let me go, there was a crowd waiting, men with ropes and torches, their faces twisted with hate. They wanted to hold their own trial. The sheriff just stood by and watched. I ran. I have been running ever since." He fell silent, the story hanging in the air between them. Clara finally understood the deep, bitter solitude he wrapped around himself like a shroud. It was not just reclusiveness. It was a shield. He had been tried and convicted not by a jury, but by the town he had called home. He had lost everything: the woman he loved, his name, his future, and he had come here, to this half-burned cabin, to let the world forget he ever existed. The revelation created a new kind of intimacy between them. By sharing his deepest wound, he had unwittingly invited her in, and in the days that followed, Clara found herself compelled to share her own. It happened 2 nights later. Wes had noticed the way she flinched whenever a log popped too loudly in the fire, the way her eyes would dart toward the door, a haunted, hunted look on her face. "You're intended," he said, breaking a long silence. Was he a cruel man? Clara looked up from the sock she was darning. She had not expected the question, nor the quiet concern in his voice. She thought of Mr. Abernathy, his fleshy hands and his wet, pursed lips. He was cruel, yes, but he was just a symptom of the disease. The true cruelty had come from her own father. "He was a means to an end," she said slowly, choosing her words with care. "My father is a powerful man, Governor Thompson. He sees the world as a series of chess moves. People are not people, they are pawns. I was a pawn." She told him everything then, the words tumbling out in a quiet, steady stream. She spoke of her father's suffocating control, the way he had isolated her after her mother's death, molding her into the perfect political bride. She told him of the threats, not of violence, but of something more insidious. Threats to ruin the families of her friends if she did not comply. Threats to cast her out with nothing, to ensure every door in society was closed to her. "He told me that a woman's only value is in the alliance she can secure," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "That my obedience was my duty, my love, my happiness. They never entered the equation. When I refused Mr. Abernathy, my father locked me in my room for 3 days. He told me that if I shamed him, He would make sure I had nothing and no one to run to, that the world was a cold, hard place for a woman alone. Wes listened, his expression unreadable, but he did not look away. He listened with an intensity that made her feel, for the first time, truly heard. When she finished, a profound sadness settled in her. She had never spoken these things aloud to anyone. "So you ran," he said. It was not a question. "I ran," she confirmed. "I chose the cold, hard world." He looked at her then, truly looked at her, and she saw a flicker of something new in his eyes. It was not pity, it was respect. He saw the steel beneath the lace. He, the outcast, recognized the survivor. And she, in turn, saw the kindness he kept buried beneath his bitterness. It was there in the way he always gave her the larger piece of their rationed food, in the way he would add a log to the fire when he thought she was sleeping, in the quiet, steady presence of him across the hearth. He was a good man who had been dealt a cruel hand. Their dynamic shifted. The cabin felt less like a cage and more like a shelter. They talked more, their conversations filling the long evenings. He told her about growing up on a ranch, about his skill with horses. She told him about the books she had read, the places she had dreamed of seeing. They were two broken pieces of entirely different worlds. But here, in this frozen bubble of time, they began to fit together. One night, the conversation turned to his limp. He had been staring into the fire, his left leg stretched out stiffly, his hand massaging the thigh. She could see a faint grimace of pain on his face. "Does it hurt much?" she asked softly. He grunted. "Always. More when the cold sets in deep." He told her about the fire, the one that had taken the other half of the cabin. It had happened the year after he fled town. A lamp had overturned in the night. He had woken up to a wall of flame. A falling beam had caught his leg, pinning him. He had managed to drag himself out, but the damage was done. He had set the bone himself, crudely, and had lain in agony for weeks, surviving on snow and hate. As he spoke, he unconsciously flexed his hand, which rested on his knee. It was a strong hand, calloused from work, but a thick, silvery scar ran from his knuckles to his wrist, a stark white line against his weathered skin. She thought of all the pain he had endured, the physical and the emotional, the loneliness of this place, the ghosts that haunted him. An impulse, warm and undeniable, moved through her. Before she could think, before she could second-guess the gesture, she reached across the small space between them and laid her hand gently over his. The reaction was instantaneous and electric. He flinched as if he had been burned, snatching his hand back, his whole body recoiling. A dark, startled look flashed across his face. Clara's heart sank. She had crossed a line. She had broken the unspoken rules that had formed between them. "I am sorry," she whispered, pulling her own hand back, her cheeks flushing with heat. "I did not mean—" But Wes did not scold her. He did not get angry. He just stared at her, his gray eyes wide with a mixture of shock and something else she could not name. It looked like fear. He was a man so accustomed to pain and solitude that a simple, gentle touch was a foreign and frightening thing. He looked down at his own scarred hand, then back at her. The air between them crackled with a new, fragile tension. He said nothing. He simply turned his gaze back to the fire, but the set of his shoulders had changed. A wall had been breached, in his sharp, reflexive withdrawal, and in his subsequent silence. She saw the truth. A seed of tenderness, small and tentative, had been planted in the frozen ground of his heart, and in the quiet warmth of the cabin, surrounded by the unending storm. It had begun, impossibly, to grow. The break in the weather came on the 10th day. It was not a thaw, but a cessation. The wind died, and the snow stopped falling, leaving behind a world of profound and unnerving silence. Entombed in white, the sun was a pale, hazy disk in a bleached sky, offering no warmth, only a glaring light that hurt the eyes. It was on that day. As Wes was scanning the horizon from the sliver of the open doorway, that he saw them. Two dark figures on horseback, miles away at the edge of the timberline. They were little more than specks against the vast, unbroken snowfield. But they moved with a purpose that made the hairs on Wes's neck stand on end. He stepped back from the door, his movements sharp and silent. "Get away from the window," he said, his voice a low, urgent command. Clara, who had been staring out at the blinding landscape, flinched at his tone. She looked at his face and saw an immediate, cold dread in his eyes. She moved away from the small pane of glass without a word, her heart beginning a slow, heavy drumbeat against her ribs. "What is it?" she whispered. "Riders," he said, not looking at her, his gaze fixed on the doorway. Two of them, following the river bend. He did not have to say who he thought they were. The possibility settled in the cold air between them. Her father's men. The world she had run from had found her. They spent the day in a state of suspended terror. They did not speak. They did not light the fire, for fear the smoke would give them away. The cold crept back into the cabin with a vengeance, seeping through the chinks in the logs. A palpable, physical enemy. They sat huddled in their blankets on opposite sides of the room, listening. The silence outside was absolute, and their own breathing sounded impossibly loud. Every creak of the cabin's logs, every soft shift of the snow on the roof, sent a fresh jolt of fear through Clara. Wes sat with his rifle across his lap, his face a grim mask of stone. He was no longer just a recluse. He was a sentinel, a protector. Clara watched him, the fear for her own safety mingling with a new, sharper fear for his. She had brought this trouble to his door. If they were found, her father's men would not be kind to the man who had sheltered her. The riders never came closer, as the pale sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, blue shadows across the snow. The two specks turned and retreated back the way they had come. Wes watched them go, his shoulders not relaxing until they had completely disappeared from view. "They are testing the terrain," he said, his voice hoarse in the silent room. "They will be back." The immediate danger had passed, but the threat lingered, a poison in the air. That night, the cold was deeper than ever before. They lit a small, careful fire, its warmth a meager defense against the chill and the darkness. But the cold had found its way inside Clara, settling deep in her soul. She slept fitfully, trapped in a maelstrom of fear. In her dreams, she was running again, but the snow was a thick, black tar that clung to her legs, pulling her down. Her father's voice echoed from the trees, cold and sharp as breaking ice, calling her name, Mr. Abernathy was there, his face pale and bloated, his hand reaching for her, the fingers tipped with frost. She tried to scream, but no sound would come out. She was back in the gilded cage, the walls closing in, the air growing thin, suffocating her. She woke with a choked cry, sitting bolt upright on her pallet of blankets. Her heart was hammering, and cold sweat slicked her skin despite the freezing air. The cabin was dark. The fire burned down to a bed of glowing red embers. She was shaking, the dream clinging to her like a shroud. A floorboard creaked. Wes's dark shape materialized from the shadows near his cot. "You are all right," he said, his voice a low rumble. It was not a question. "A nightmare," she whispered, wrapping her arms around herself. She could not stop shivering. The terror of the dream was still so real, the feeling of being trapped, of being caught. He hesitated for a moment, a silhouette of indecision in the dying light of the fire. Then, he moved to the hearth and knelt beside her. He was close enough that she could feel the faint warmth radiating from him. He did not speak. Instead, he awkwardly, hesitantly, reached out and placed his hand on her back, between her shoulder blades. His touch was tentative, almost clumsy, as if he were handling something fragile he was afraid of breaking. But it was solid, It was real. It was the first time he had touched her with deliberate, gentle intention. The warmth of his palm spread through the thin fabric of her dress, a small, steady anchor in the swirling chaos of her fear. He just held it there, his silent presence a comfort more profound than any words could have been. Gradually, her shivering subsided, and the frantic beating of her heart slowed. He did not pull away until her breathing was deep and even again, until the ghost of her father's voice had finally faded from the room. The next morning, the reality of their situation was stark and unavoidable. "You need to know how to use this," Wes said, nodding to the rifle propped against the wall. "If they come back and I am busy, you cannot be helpless." He took her outside into the blinding white of the new day. The air was so cold it burned to breathe. He showed her how to hold the rifle, how to brace its heavy wooden stock against her shoulder. His hands guided hers, his fingers briefly brushing against her own. The touch was impersonal, instructive, but a jolt of awareness shot through Clara. His proximity was overwhelming in the vast, open space. She was acutely aware of the rough texture of his coat, the scent of wood smoke and pine that clung to him, the low timbre of his voice in her ear as he explained the workings of the sight. "Squeeze the trigger," he instructed. "Do not pull it." She aimed at a blackened knot on a distant, snow-laden pine. The rifle was heavy, unwieldy in her arms. She took a breath, held it, and squeezed. The explosion was deafening, a brutal crack that shattered the sacred silence of the valley. The recoil slammed the stock into her shoulder, a vicious, painful kick that made her cry out and stumble backward. Wes caught her arm, steadying her. A rare, faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. "It has a bit of a mule in it." Clara rubbed her shoulder, her ears ringing, but a strange, exhilarating feeling washed over her. The raw power of the weapon was terrifying, but it was also a promise. It was a way to fight back. She looked at Wes, at the ghost of a smile on his hard face, and an answering smile bloomed on her own. And then, for the first time, a sound that neither of them had heard in a long, long time echoed in the cold, clear air. They laughed. It was a short, unexpected burst of sound, his a low, rusty rumble, hers a clear, bright peal. It was the sound of a shared, ridiculous moment in the midst of a desperate situation. The laughter died as quickly as it came, the grim reality of why she was holding a rifle creeping back in. But the moment lingered between them, a small, warm ember. Later that day, their shared purpose took a different form. Wes took the rifle and disappeared into the woods, moving with a silent, practiced grace despite his limp. He returned 2 hours later, a snowshoe rabbit dangling from his hand, its white fur stained with a single, bright drop of crimson. Food, real food. The sight of it made Clara's stomach ache with a hunger so sharp it was painful. "We will not be able to cook it all at once," he said, laying the rabbit on a clean patch of snow near the door. "But we can make a stew. It will last longer." He handed her his knife. "You will have to learn this, too." Clara looked from the knife to the still warm body of the rabbit. The governor's daughter in her recoiled. She had never seen an animal prepared for a meal. Only the finished product served on fine china. But the woman who had survived a week in a blizzard, who had learned to split wood and fire a rifle, took the knife without hesitation. He showed her how to gut it, his instructions clipped and practical. It was a bloody, visceral task, but she did it. With her hands covered in the lifeblood of the small creature, she felt another piece of her old self fall away, replaced by someone harder, more resilient. Someone who knew what it took to survive. They ate that night in a comfortable silence. The stew was thin, mostly broth and a few stringy pieces of meat, but it was the most delicious thing Clara had ever tasted. It was hot and savory, the taste of life itself. It was the first time in days they had both eaten their fill, for the first time since she had arrived. She felt a flicker of something more than just survival. She felt a sliver of peace. The shared meal, the shared laughter, the shared fear. It all worked to erode the walls between them. The emotional distance shrank until the physical confines of the cabin became charged with a new, unspoken energy. Their accidental brushes were no longer just accidental. They lingered, a spark of heat in the cold air. She would catch him watching her as she mended a tear in his blanket, his gray eyes holding a look of quiet intensity that made her breath catch. When she handed him a cup of coffee, their fingers would touch, and a current would pass between them, as real and potent as a lightning strike. One evening, his limp seemed worse than usual. He sat by the fire, his legs stretched out, his jaw tight with a pain he refused to speak of. Clara remembered seeing a small tin of bear fat and a bundle of dried herbs on one of the shelves. Her mother had used a similar balm for aches and pains. "Let me help," she said quietly. He looked up, his eyes wary. "There is nothing to be done." "There might be," she insisted. She retrieved the items and mixed a small amount of the grease with the crushed herbs in the palm of her hand, creating a pungent, earthy-smelling salve. She knelt before him. "Please, Wes, let me try." He stared at her for a long moment, a battle of pride and pain warring in his eyes. Finally, with a low sigh of resignation, he nodded. She gently rolled up his trouser leg. The skin was a roadmap of old injuries, a patchwork of white scars and discolored, taut flesh over the hard muscle of his thigh. Her touch was gentle as she began to massage the warm salve into his leg. He flinched at first, his muscles tense as iron beneath her hands. "Relax," she murmured, her voice soft. "I will not hurt you." Slowly, under the steady pressure of her hands, the tension began to seep out of him. She worked in silence, her focus entirely on the task, on the feel of the knotted muscle and scarred tissue. As she worked, he began to speak, his voice low and strained, as if the words themselves were being pulled from a deep, painful place. "When they had me in that cell," he said, his eyes fixed on the fire, "the sheriff let some of the men in at night, the ones whose wives had thought Annabelle was a saint. They wanted a confession." He took a ragged breath. "They would hang me by my wrists from the ceiling until my shoulders felt like they were tearing from their sockets. They would hold my head in a bucket of ice water until my lungs burned. All the while, they asked me questions. Did you enjoy it? Did she beg? Why did you do it? Calder." His voice broke on the last words. Clara stopped massaging, her hands resting on his leg, her heart aching for the cruelty he had suffered. This was the source of his haunted eyes, the reason he flinched from a gentle touch. He had been brutalized, not just by a lynch mob, but by the law that was supposed to protect him. "They broke more than just my leg in that fire," he whispered, his voice thick with a pain that was more than physical. "They broke my trust in anything good ever happening to me again." She did not know what to say. There were no words that could heal a wound that deep. So she just continued her work, her silent, steady touch a testament to her presence, an answer to his loneliness. When she was finished, she gently pulled his trouser leg back down. He looked at her, his eyes raw with vulnerability. In that moment, the last of the walls between them crumbled to dust. The chemistry that had been simmering beneath the surface now boiled over. The air in the small cabin was thick with it. Every glance was held a moment too long. Every word was freighted with unspoken meaning. The space between them felt both vast and non-existent. One night, as she was banking the fire for the evening, she felt his eyes on her. It was a different kind of look, one that traveled over her face, her hair, the curve of her neck. It was the look of a man seeing a woman for the very first time. Her skin prickled with awareness. She turned to face him, her heart thumping a slow, heavy rhythm. "Why will you not look at me?" she asked, her voice a low, trembling whisper. "Not really. Not like a woman." His face shuddered, the familiar mask of bitter solitude slamming back into place. I do not know what you mean. You do, she insisted, taking a step closer. She would not let him retreat now. I see it in your eyes sometimes, but you always pull back. Why? Are you afraid of me? A harsh, humorless laugh escaped him. Afraid of you? He shook his head, looking away from her, toward the fire. I am afraid of me. Clara, everything I touch turns to ash. I had a life, a woman I loved, a future, and it all burned. This cabin, my leg, my name. I am a ghost, a bad luck charm. I will not be the one to bring that ruin down on you too. His confession hung in the air, a raw and honest admission of his deepest fear. He was not rejecting her. He was trying to protect her, in the only way he knew how. The next night, a bitter cold snap descended. The temperature plummeted, and the frost on the inside of the window pane grew thick and feathery. Even with the fire roaring, the cabin was freezing. They huddled in their separate blankets, the cold a relentless, invading force. Clara shivered uncontrollably, her teeth chattering. She looked over at Wes. He was sitting with his back against the wall, his own blanket wrapped tightly around him, but she could see the shivers that racked his frame. On impulse, driven by the cold and by a desperate, aching need for something more, she stood up. She walked the few steps to his side and, without a word, slid under his blanket, pressing her cold body against his. He went rigid, his whole body tensing as if he had been struck. "Clara, do not," he started to say, his voice a strained whisper. "I am so cold. Wes," she said, her voice muffled against his chest. But it was more than that. It was a hunger for warmth, for contact, for the simple, undeniable heat of another human being. She tipped her head back to look at him. His face was inches from hers, his gray eyes dark and turbulent in the firelight. She saw the fear in them, but she also saw a deep, desperate longing that mirrored her own. Slowly, hesitantly, he raised a hand and cupped her jaw, his thumb stroking her cheek. His touch was both rough and tender. He leaned in, and his lips met hers. The kiss was not gentle. It was desperate and hesitant, a collision of hunger and fear. It was the taste of coffee and wood smoke and a loneliness so profound it felt like a physical ache. It was all the unspoken words, all the shared glances, all the pent-up tension of the past weeks, finally given release. It was a drowning man's gasp for air. The moment was perfect, a fragile, beautiful thing forged in the heart of the storm. And then the world shattered. A single gunshot exploded in the night, the sound impossibly loud, ripping through the silence. A splinter of wood flew from the doorframe, inches from where they were sitting. The moment of tender, feral connection was instantly obliterated, replaced by the cold, hard reality of the gun. The trackers had found them. The instant the gunshot tore through their fragile world, Wes reacted. There was no thought, only a primal, coiled instinct. He threw them both sideways, away from the door, his body shielding Clara's as they hit the hard-packed earth floor. The lingering warmth of their kiss was instantly replaced by the icy shock of adrenaline. Another shot splintered the wood of the door, louder this time, a brutal declaration of war. "Stay down," he snarled, his voice a low, feral growl. He was already moving, rolling away from her and grabbing the rifle that had been leaning against the hearth. He moved with a terrifying grace, his limp forgotten in the fluid, deadly economy of motion. A coarse voice shouted from the darkness outside, a sound that made Clara's blood run cold. "We know you are in there. Calder, the governor wants the girl. Send her out, and we might just let you live." Wes did not answer. He crawled to the side of the small, grimy window, keeping his silhouette low. He peered out into the moonlit snow. Two men, bundled in thick coats, were crouched behind a line of aspens about 50 yards away. Their horses were tethered farther back. They were confident, arrogant. They thought they had a lone man trapped. "Do not be a fool," the second man yelled. We saw her light a fire 2 nights ago. Just give her up. Clara, huddled behind the overturned table she had taken cover behind, felt a fresh wave of guilt and terror. They were here because of her. She had led them right to him. Wes leveled the rifle on the edge of the window frame. He was impossibly calm, his breathing slow and steady. He was not the gentleman who had tended her frostbite, nor the haunted soul who had confessed his fears. This was another man entirely, one forged in the harshest fires of survival. "I am going to fire 1 shot," he whispered to her, his voice tight. "When I do, they will fire back at the window. You stay low. Do not move." He took a breath, let it out slowly, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle roared in the confines of the cabin, the sound a physical blow. Outside, there was a sharp cry of pain and a curse. An immediate volley of pistol shots answered, peppering the front of the cabin. Bullets thudded into the thick logs, and one shattered the small window pane, letting in a blast of freezing air and a shower of glass. "My arm, the son of a—" The injured man's voice faded into a groan. "Get him on his horse," the other man shouted, his voice laced with panic now. "He will pay for this. You hear me? Calder. We will be back with 10 more men." Clara heard the frantic sound of them scrambling in the snow, the nervous whinny of the horses. A few moments later, the sound of hoofbeats receded, galloping away into the vast, cold silence. They were gone. For now. The silence that descended was heavier, more menacing than before. Wes remained at the window for a long minute, his rifle still raised, scanning the empty landscape. Finally, he lowered the weapon and turned to her. In the dim firelight, his face was a hard, unforgiving mask. The tenderness of their kiss was a distant memory, burned away by gunpowder. "You have to go," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Now, before they come back." Clara pushed herself up, her legs trembling. "Go where? They are out there." "They have gone back toward town," he said, already moving, stuffing a half loaf of hard bread and a strip of dried meat into a small canvas sack. "It will take them hours. You can head north, follow the high ridge. It will be harder going, but they will not expect it. You can be miles away by sunrise." He thrust the sack into her hands. The coldness in his voice hurt more than any bullet could have. He was pushing her away, building the walls back up, higher and thicker than before. "I am not leaving you," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "Listen to me," he said, his voice rising with a desperate intensity. He gripped her shoulders, his fingers digging into her flesh. "Did you not hear them? They are coming back with more men. I held off 2. I cannot hold off 10. They will kill me, and they will take you. Your only chance is to run." "No," she said, looking straight into his turbulent gray eyes. "I am done running. I have been running my whole life. From my father, from my future, from myself. I will not run anymore." The words came from a place of deep, newfound conviction. To leave now would be to leave the only thing that had ever felt real, the only person who had ever seen her for who she truly was. To run now would be to abandon him to a fate she had brought upon him. "Clara, you do not understand," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "I told you I bring ruin. This is it. This is what I do. I am a plague. You have to get away from me." "What you are is a good man that bad things have happened to," she countered, her voice growing stronger. She raised her hands and covered his on her shoulders. "And what I am is a woman who is choosing to stay. Here, with you. We will face them together." He stared at her, his face a canvas of anguish and disbelief. He saw the unyielding strength in her eyes, the fierce determination. She was no longer the half-frozen, terrified bride who had collapsed in his doorway. She was a woman of fire and steel. With a shuddering sigh, he dropped his hands, the fight going out of him. He had offered her the only protection he knew, distance, and she had refused it. "All right," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Together, then." A new, grim purpose settled over them. They spent the next hour preparing for a siege. They barricaded the door with the heavy cot and the last of the broken furniture. West checked his ammunition. His movements precise and economical. He had less than 24 rounds left. It would not be enough. Clara tore strips from the remnants of her petticoat to use as bandages. Her mind strangely calm. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a fierce resolve. As they worked in the flickering firelight, the unspoken tension from their interrupted kiss returned, charged with the new, desperate intimacy of their shared fate. They moved around each other in the small space, their bodies brushing, each touch a reminder of what was at stake. Finally, there was nothing left to do but wait. They sat before the fire, the rifle on the floor between them. The silence was thick with all the things they had not said. Clara knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she might not live to see another dawn, and in the face of that stark reality, all pretense, all fear of rejection, fell away. "I love you, Wes," she said, her voice soft but clear in the quiet cabin. He flinched as if she had struck him. He would not look at her. He stared into the flames, his jaw clenched so tight a muscle jumped. "Do not say that," he rasped. "It is the truth," she said, her heart aching at his rejection. "I know it is not what you want to hear." "It is not about what I want." He cut her off, his voice rough with pain. He finally turned to look at her, and his eyes were filled with a terrible, self-loathing agony. "Love is for men who have something to offer, a future, a name that is not cursed. I have nothing. Clara, I am a ghost in a burned-out cabin. I do not deserve love, especially not yours." His words were meant to push her away, but they did the opposite. They laid bare the deep, festering wound in his soul. He believed himself unworthy, a man condemned. Her heart broke for him, and in that breaking, her love for him solidified into something fierce and unconditional. She did not argue. She simply held his gaze, letting him see the truth in her eyes. The night deepened around them, the freezing silence of the wilderness pressing in. In that silence, with the threat of death hanging over them, they finally gave in. He reached for her, his movement a surrender. His scarred hand came up to cup her face, his thumb stroking her cheekbone with a reverence that made her tremble. He leaned in and kissed her again, and this time there was no hesitation. It was a kiss of profound and aching sadness, a desperate claiming in the face of oblivion. The firelight danced on their skin as they came together on the bearskin rug. It was a collision of two lonely, wounded souls seeking solace. There was a feral hunger to it, a stripping away of everything but the raw, primitive need to feel, to connect, to be alive in what could be their final hours. His hands mapped the lines of her body, learning her with a desperate urgency. She clung to him, her fingers tracing the scars on his back, each one a testament to the pain he had endured. But beneath the feral desperation, there was an unexpected tenderness. He was gentle, almost worshipful, his eyes never leaving hers. It was a slow, aching discovery, a silent language of touch that said everything they could not speak. It was two broken halves finding a fleeting, fragile wholeness in the dark. In the heart of a frozen, violent world, they created a small, sacred space of warmth and belonging, a defiant act of life against the encroaching darkness. Clara woke to a chilling stillness. The first gray light of dawn was filtering through the chinks in the logs. The fire was a low bed of embers, and the cabin was cold. She reached out, but the space beside her was empty. She sat up, clutching the blanket to her chest. "Wes?" she called softly. There was no answer. The cabin was empty. His rifle was gone. His heavy coat and boots were gone. A cold, sick dread washed over her. He had left her. After everything, after the intimacy they had shared, he had abandoned her to face her father's men alone. The pain of it was a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. Then she saw it. On the floor by the hearth, where he had been sitting, was the small canvas sack of food he had packed for her earlier. He had left it for her. He had not abandoned her. He had gone to face the danger himself, to draw them away from her. The realization was somehow worse. He had gone to sacrifice himself. The hours that followed were the longest of her life. She paced the small cabin like a caged animal, her mind a torment of terrifying possibilities. She kept the fire low, straining to hear any sound from outside over the frantic beating of her own heart. But there was only silence. The sun rose higher in the sky, a watery, indifferent eye. Midday came and went. The dread in her stomach twisted into a knot of pure agony. In the early afternoon, the sky began to change. The pale blue grayed over, and the air grew heavy and still. Then, the first flakes of snow began to fall. They were thick and wet, coming down faster and faster until the world outside was once more a swirling vortex of white. A new storm had arrived, and with it, a new kind of despair. If he was out in this, lost or wounded, he would never survive. She was huddled by the dying fire, wrapped in a blanket. When the door bar rattled, she leaped to her feet, her heart seizing in her chest. Was it her father's men? Had they found her? She grabbed the small kindling axe, the only weapon she had, her hands slick with sweat. The door groaned open, and a figure stumbled in, half collapsing over the threshold, bringing a swirl of snow and freezing wind into the room. It was Wes. He was a terrible sight. His face was pale and drawn, a nasty, bleeding cut on his forehead just above his eye. His knuckles were bruised and split, and his coat was torn at the shoulder. He slammed the door shut and leaned against it, his breathing coming in ragged, painful gasps. "Wes!" she cried, rushing to his side. He waved her off, pushing himself upright, his face grim. "I'm all right." He limped to the fire and sank to the floor, his body trembling with cold and exhaustion. "What happened? Where did you go?" she demanded, kneeling in front of him, dabbing at the cut on his head with a clean rag. He took a long, shuddering breath. "I went to town," he said, his voice hoarse. I thought if I could end this, if I could clear my name, they would have no more hold over you. No reason to come after you for helping a wanted man." He told her how he had gone not to the sheriff, but to the preacher. He had found the old man in the church, praying. Wes had confronted him, not with threats, but with the simple, damning truth. He had told the preacher that his silence had condemned an innocent man, that Annabelle's true killer was still free because of his cowardice. He had begged him, for the sake of his own soul, to finally tell the truth. And the preacher, a man tormented by his conscience for years, had finally broken. He had confessed that he knew Wes was innocent. He had been in the church that night, working on his sermon, and had seen Annabelle arguing with another man, a prominent town council member known for his violent temper when he drank. The preacher had been too afraid of the powerful man to come forward. He had written it all down, a full confession of what he had seen, and signed it. "He gave me this," Wes said, pulling a folded piece of paper from inside his coat. Proof. Clara's heart soared with a wild, impossible hope. "So it is over?" Wes's face darkened, and the hope in her chest died. "I took it to the sheriff. He read it, and then he laughed. He said it was just the ramblings of a senile old preacher, coerced by a desperate killer. He told me to get out of his town before he locked me up again for good." Wes looked down at his bruised knuckles. "Some of his deputies tried to stop me from leaving. I had to fight my way out." He had escaped, but just barely. He had the truth in his hands, but it was worthless. The law, the entire world, was still set against him. Clara gently took the precious, folded paper from his hand. She looked from it to his battered, exhausted face. He had risked everything for her, for a future he did not even believe he deserved. He had faced down his past and fought his way back to her, only to be met with the same bitter injustice. She nursed him through the night, cleaning his wounds, forcing him to drink hot broth. He finally fell into a fitful, exhausted sleep, his head in her lap. As she sat there in the quiet darkness, listening to the storm rage outside, she stroked his hair, her heart filled with a fierce, protective love. He was her home, he was her world, and she would not let it be taken from them. Just before dawn, he stirred, his eyes fluttering open. He looked up at her, his gaze clear and filled with a devastating sadness. "I love you, Clara," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He raised a hand to touch her face. "But it does not matter. We can never be free." The storm that had brought Wes back to her raged for a full day, a swirling white fury that matched the turmoil in Clara's heart. In its aftermath, a fragile, exhausted peace settled over the valley. They did not speak of the future. They did not speak of the men who were surely coming. They existed only in the small, warm space of the cabin. A world of two, but in every shared glance, in every lingering touch, the unspoken truth lay between them. Their time was running out. It was Wes who finally broke the silence. On the second morning after his return, the sun was out, casting a brilliant, blinding glare across the snow. He had been staring at the preacher's signed confession, which lay on the rough-hewn plank they now used as a table. "You have to take this," he said, his voice quiet but resolute. "You have to leave." Clara, who was stirring their meager breakfast of watery oatmeal, froze. "We have been over this. I am not leaving you." "This is different," he insisted, standing up and beginning to pace, his limp more pronounced with his agitation. "Before, running was just running, delaying the inevitable. This," he tapped the folded paper, "this is a weapon, but it is useless here. The sheriff in town proved that. It is worthless in the hands of a man they have already condemned." He stopped and faced her, his gray eyes burning with a desperate, painful clarity. "But it is not worthless in your hands. You are Governor Thompson's daughter. You can get an audience with men who will listen. Men in the capital. Men who are bigger than a backwoods sheriff and a town full of old grudges. You can take this to them and force them to see the truth." "And what about you?" she challenged, her voice rising. "I should just leave you here, a sitting duck for my father's men or the sheriff's posse?" "They will not be looking for me to be alone," he argued, his voice pleading. "They will be looking for two of us. If you are gone, it buys me time. I can move, hide in the high country. I know these mountains better than my own skin. I can survive." She saw the logic in his plan, a cold, hard logic that terrified her. But the thought of leaving him, of being separated by miles of this brutal wilderness, was a physical pain. "I will not go," she whispered, shaking her head. He crossed the space between them in 2 strides and took her face in his hands, forcing her to look at him. His touch was urgent, his thumbs stroking her cheeks. "Clara, listen to me. This is our only chance, not just for me to clear my name. For us. Do you understand? This is the only path that ends with us having a future. Any other path ends with one of us in a cage and the other in a grave. I cannot bear that. I will not—" His raw vulnerability undid her. He was not pushing her away to protect himself. He was sending her away to save them both. It was an act of profound, agonizing faith. Faith in her, and in a world that had shown him nothing but cruelty. Tears welled in her eyes, hot against his cold fingers. "All right," she breathed, the word a surrender and a vow. "I will go, but you have to promise me something." "Anything," he said, his voice thick. "You have to promise me you will survive. You will not do anything reckless. You will not give up. You will wait for me. Swear it to me." "Wes." "I swear it," he said, his voice solemn. He leaned down and kissed her. A deep, lingering kiss filled with the salt of her tears and the bitter taste of farewell. It was a kiss that had to last an unknown amount of time, across an unknown distance. They prepared for her departure in a flurry of grim, purposeful activity. Wes had a horse, a sturdy Mustang he kept hidden in a sheltered canyon a mile from the cabin. He packed the small canvas sack with the last of the rabbit jerky and a few hard biscuits. He gave her his spare blanket and his sharpest knife. He folded the preacher's statement and tucked it deep into an inner pocket of her dress, the fragile paper a secret shield over her heart. When it was time to go, he led her to the horse. The world was a vast, silent expanse of white and blue. The cold was a clean, sharp bite in the air, standing there, beside the restless horse. The cabin looked so small, so fragile against the immensity of the mountains. "Follow the river east," he instructed, his hands on her waist as he lifted her into the saddle. "It will eventually lead you to the main road to the capital. Ride hard, and do not stop for anyone." She looked down at him, her heart feeling as if it were being torn from her chest. He looked gaunt and weary, but his eyes held a flicker of hope she had never seen there before. "I will come back for you," she said, her voice fierce. "I will be waiting," he promised. She did not look back as she rode away. If she had, she was not sure she would have had the strength to keep going. She fixed her eyes on the eastern horizon and rode, the steady rhythm of the horse's hooves a counterpoint to the frantic beating of her own heart. For 2 days, she rode through a world of blinding white. She moved in a trance of cold and determination, stopping only to rest the horse and chew on the tough, salty jerky. The hope, fragile as it was, kept her warm. The preacher's words, a testament to the truth, felt like a tangible weight in her bodice. She was no longer running. She was on a righteous quest. It was on the 3rd day, as she was nearing the main road, that her world came crashing down. She had stopped to water the horse at a place where the river ran fast enough to resist the ice. As she stood, her back to the trail, she heard the crunch of snow behind her. She whirled around, her hand flying to the knife at her belt, but she was too late. 2 men stepped out from a thicket of pines, rifles leveled at her chest. She recognized them instantly from the night of the attack on the cabin. One had his arm in a crude sling, his face pale and twisted with malice. It was the man Wes had shot. "Well, well," the uninjured one said with a cruel smile, his eyes raking over her. "Look what we have here, the governor's runaway daughter. All alone." Despair, cold and absolute, washed over her. She had been so careful. How had they found her? "Your father is a very smart man, miss," the man said, as if reading her thoughts. "He figured you would need a horse, and there is only one place to get a horse for 100 miles. We have been watching the stables in town since we got back. When we saw Calder ride in and then leave a few days ago, we knew something was up. We just had to wait for you to come to us." They closed in on her, their movements confident and slow. She had no chance to fight, no chance to run. They took the knife from her belt and the reins from her hand. The man with the sling roughly patted her down, his hands lingering in a way that made her skin crawl. His fingers found the folded paper in her dress. He pulled it out, a triumphant sneer on his face. "What is this? A love letter from your outlaw?" He unfolded it, and his eyes scanned the page. A flicker of confusion, then, understanding, crossed his face. He handed it to his partner. The other man read it, his eyebrows rising. He let out a low whistle. The preacher finally found his spine, did he? He looked at Clara, then at the paper, and then he began to laugh, a harsh, ugly sound. Without another word, he ripped the confession in 2, and then in 4, and let the pieces flutter down onto the snow like dead leaves. Clara cried out, a sound of pure anguish, as if he had torn a piece of her own flesh. It was over. Wes's only hope, their only hope, was gone. The journey back to the capital was a blur of misery. She was a prisoner, bound and watched, her spirit as cold and dead as the winter landscape. When they arrived at her father's estate, she was not treated as a daughter, but as a captured fugitive. She was hustled through a back entrance and locked in her old bedroom. It was just as she had left it, a beautiful, opulent cage. But now the gilded bars felt colder and harder than ever. Her father came to her that evening. He did not shout or rage. His control was far more terrifying. He stood in the center of the room, his hands clasped behind his back, his face a mask of cold disappointment. "You have caused me a great deal of trouble. Clara," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "You have embarrassed me. You have consorted with a wanted criminal. And for what? Some foolish, romantic notion of freedom?" "He is an innocent man," she said, her voice trembling with a rage that was all she had left. Her father waved a dismissive hand. "His innocence is irrelevant. He is a nobody, a piece of dust. What is relevant is the arrangement I have made with Mr. Abernathy, an arrangement you will honor." He took a step closer, his eyes like chips of ice. "The wedding is in 2 days. You will be there. You will smile. You will say your vows. And you will be a dutiful wife." "And if I refuse?" she spat. A thin, cruel smile touched his lips. "Then my associates in the territories will be very interested to learn the exact location of the outlaw who sheltered you. A federal warrant is a powerful thing. A man like that, a known murderer who has resisted arrest, he would not be taken alive. There would be a reward. He would be hunted down like a dog and shot. His body would be left for the wolves." The threat, so calm and coldly delivered, sucked the air from her lungs. This was the ultimatum. Her compliance for Wes's life. He had her trapped completely. For a full day, she succumbed to despair. She sat by the window, staring out at a world that no longer held any color, any hope. Wes was waiting for her, and she had failed him. She had led him to his doom. But as the second day dawned, the day of her wedding, something shifted inside her. The despair did not vanish, but it burned away into a hard, cold fury. She thought of Wes, of his courage, of his belief in her. She thought of his promise to wait. She would not let her father win. She would not let them destroy the one good, true thing she had ever had. She was done being a pawn. Her hope came in the form of a young servant girl named Eliza, who came to help her dress for the wedding. Eliza had always been kind, with quiet, sympathetic eyes. As she was lacing up the back of the hated wedding gown, Clara spoke, her voice a low, urgent whisper. "Eliza, I need your help. My father is a tyrant, and he is trying to force me into this marriage to save a man's life." She told her everything, a condensed, desperate version of the truth about Wes, about his innocence, about her father's ultimatum. She saw the flicker of fear in the young girl's eyes, but she also saw a spark of defiance. Eliza, too, had felt the sting of the governor's cold ambition. "What can I do?" Eliza whispered back. "There is a new federal marshal in the territorial capital, a man named Reed. He is not my father's man. I need to get to him. I need a horse and a distraction." That night, a plan was hatched in hushed whispers. Eliza, using a forged note, would tell the stable master that one of the governor's prize horses needed to be taken to the farrier at dawn. She would saddle it for a long ride. Then, just as the household was beginning to stir, she would accidentally knock over a large oil lamp in a storage closet, starting a small, smoky fire that would draw everyone's attention. In the ensuing chaos, Clara would slip out the servants' entrance and ride like the wind. It was a desperate, flimsy plan, but it was all they had. Clara rode back west, not toward the cabin, but toward the town Wes had fled. She rode with a singular, burning purpose. She had no proof now, no piece of paper. She had only the truth, and she would make them listen. She arrived in town covered in dust, her fine riding clothes torn and muddied. She bypassed the sheriff's office and went straight to the hotel where the new mayor had his office. She stormed past a bewildered clerk and threw open the door. A stern-looking man with a large mustache and a silver star on his chest looked up in surprise. The federal marshal. "Marshal Reed," she said, her voice ringing with an authority she did not know she possessed. "I am Clara Thompson. and I am here to report a gross miscarriage of justice and to stop the murder of an innocent man." For an hour, she held him and the mayor captive with her story. She told them everything, her words clear and unwavering. When she was done, the marshal looked at her, his expression grim. "It is a compelling story, miss, but without the preacher's statement, it is just that, a story." "Then you will hear it from him yourself," she declared. She went to the church, a place of quiet hypocrisy, and found the preacher arranging hymn books. He looked up at her, and his face went pale with fear. "You?" he stammered. "Yes, me," she said, her voice as cold and hard as steel. "You gave Wes Calder a piece of paper. My father's men destroyed it. Now you are going to give me something better. You are going to give me your voice. You are going to come with me to the marshal, and you are going to tell him, under oath, what you saw that night." "I cannot," he whispered, wringing his hands. "They will ruin me." Clara stepped closer, her eyes blazing with a righteous fury. "They will ruin you. Your silence has already ruined an innocent man. It has allowed a killer to walk free. Do you think God does not see that? Do you think he will forgive your cowardice? You will come with me now, or I will stand on the steps of this church, and I will tell this entire town what a pathetic, spineless hypocrite you are. You will tell the truth. Today." An hour later, in the mayor's office, the preacher, sweating and trembling, retold his story under the marshal's intense gaze. He named the killer. He described the argument he had witnessed. He confessed his own fear and silence. When he was done, a heavy silence filled the room. The truth, after so many years, was finally out. The marshal turned to the mayor. "It seems we have a murderer on our town council, and an innocent man hiding in the mountains." He stood up, his face set with grim determination. "I will take 2 deputies and ride out to the councilman's estate and arrest him. In the meantime," he turned to the sheriff, who had been summoned and now stood looking pale and uncomfortable. "Sheriff, you will form a posse. You have an active warrant for Wesley Calder. Ride out to his cabin and bring him in." Clara's blood ran cold. "No!" she cried. "You cannot! He is innocent!" "According to the law, Miss Thompson," the marshal said, his voice firm but not unkind. "He is a fugitive wanted for murder until a judge says otherwise. The warrant stands. The sheriff has his duty." A posse. The word was a death sentence. The sheriff, shamed and exposed, would not be gentle. His men, the same men who had once formed a lynch mob, would be looking for an excuse to put a bullet in Wes before he could ever tell his side of the story. She had done it. She had cleared his name, only to sign his death warrant. She had to get to him first. She turned and ran from the office, her mind screaming one single desperate thought. She had to reach the cabin before the posse did. The horse was a force of nature, a living, breathing extension of Clara's own desperate will. Each powerful stride devoured the snow-covered ground, carrying her away from the town and its suffocating pretense of justice, back toward the raw, honest wilderness where Wes waited. She rode not with grace, but with a frantic, punishing urgency, her body low over the animal's neck, the wind a physical blow against her face, the sky, a deceptive, placid blue when she had left the marshal's office, was already beginning to curdle in the west, the clouds gathering in a bruised, purple mass that promised another storm. She was in a race, not just against the posse, but against the mountains themselves. Her mind was a maelstrom of fear and prayer. She pictured the sheriff, a man whose authority had just been exposed as a sham, his pride wounded. He would not be leading a mission of justice. He would be leading one of vengeance. His men, the same faces that had likely gathered with ropes and torches years ago, would be eager to finish the job the law had denied them. They would ride hard and shoot first. They would see a fugitive, not an innocent man. The thought was a spur, driving her to push the horse harder, faster. The familiar landmarks began to appear, the sharp bend in the frozen river, The stand of skeletal aspens where her carriage had crashed a lifetime ago. The high ridge that overlooked the hidden valley. As she climbed, the first flakes of snow began to fall. Not the gentle, silent flakes of previous days, but hard, stinging pellets driven by a rising wind. The world began to lose its sharp edges, the distant mountains dissolving into a gray haze. The storm was coming, a white beast intent on swallowing the world. She urged the horse down the treacherous slope into the valley, its hooves sinking deep into the fresh powder. The cabin was barely visible, a dark smudge against the swirling white. The smoke from its chimney a thin, desperate signal. Hope and terror warred in her chest. He was there. He was alive. But for how much longer? She practically fell from the saddle, her legs numb and weak, and stumbled toward the door. It was barred from the inside. She pounded on the thick wood, her voice raw and hoarse from the wind. "Wes, it is me. It is Clara. Let me in." For a terrifying moment, there was no answer. Then she heard the heavy scrape of the bar being lifted. The door swung open, and he stood there, his face a mask of disbelief and anguish. He was holding his rifle, and his left sleeve was dark with a fresh blood stain, a crude bandage tied hastily around his upper arm. "Clara, what in God's name are you doing here?" he rasped, pulling her inside, out of the teeth of the blizzard. "I told you to run." "The posse is coming," she said, her words tumbling out in a breathless rush. "The sheriff is leading them. They are not coming to talk. Wes, they are coming to kill you." He did not seem surprised. He gestured to his arm. "I know. Ran into one of their scouts on the ridge an hour ago. He got a lucky shot in before he ran." He was already moving, his face a grim, resolute mask. He kicked the bar back into place across the door and began stuffing what little he had, a blanket, his knife, the last of the ammunition, into a worn leather satchel. He was preparing to flee. "What are you doing?" she cried, grabbing his uninjured arm. "What I promised you I would do," he said, his voice hard as granite. He would not look at her. "I am surviving. I will lead them up into the high passes. In this storm, they will never catch me." "No," she pleaded, her heart fracturing. He did not know. He did not believe. "You do not understand. You do not have to run anymore. Wes, look at me." She forced her body in front of his, making him stop. She took his face in her hands, her fingers cold against his stubbled skin. "I did it. I went to the town. I made the preacher talk. He told the marshal everything, under oath. They know you are innocent. They have arrested the man who killed Annabelle." He stared at her, his gray eyes searching her face, his expression a maelstrom of confusion, disbelief, and a terrible, wounded hope he was too afraid to feel. "The sheriff, he sent a posse. The sheriff is a liar and a coward, and he is trying to bury his own sins by burying you," she said, her voice ringing with conviction. "But the marshal knows the truth. He gave me his word. Justice is coming. Wes, real justice. But you have to be here for it. You have to stay. You have to trust me." He shook his head slowly, the ingrained instinct of the hunted warring with a desperate plea in her eyes. "Trust," he whispered, the word a foreign, painful thing on his tongue. "The last time I trusted the law, it put a rope around my neck. The last time I trusted this town, it lit torches. Trust is a fool's game. Clara." "Then trust me," she begged, tears streaming down her face, freezing on her cheeks. "I have not come all this way. I have not faced down my father and a whole town of hypocrites, just to watch you run. I love you. Please, just a little longer. Trust us." He looked into her eyes, and in their depths, he saw not the naivety of a sheltered girl, but the fierce, unwavering strength of the woman who had fought for him. He saw the truth, a truth more powerful than all his years of pain and cynicism. The tension in his shoulders seemed to melt, the hard lines of his face softening. The fight went out of him, replaced by a profound, bone-deep weariness. He let the satchel fall from his hand. All right, Clara, he breathed, his voice ragged with emotion. I will wait. The sound of hoofbeats came less than an hour later, a muffled, rhythmic thudding that was barely audible over the howl of the blizzard. They stood together in the center of the cabin, the firelight casting their long shadows on the log walls. Wes held his rifle, not aggressively, but at rest, his posture one of weary resignation. Clara stood beside him, her hand gripping his, her heart hammering against her ribs. A voice bellowed from outside, barely carrying over the wind. Calder, this is the sheriff. Come out with your hands in the air. Wes and Clara exchanged a look, a silent acknowledgement that this was the end, one way or another. Before either of them could move, another voice, louder and clearer, cut through the storm. Hold your fire! Sheriff, you and your men will stand down. That is an order. Through the swirling snow, a group of riders materialized. At their head was not the sheriff, but the stern, mustachioed figure of Federal Marshal Reed. He rode forward, his horse stopping just before the cabin. He held up a folded piece of paper. Wesley Calder, the marshal's voice boomed, carrying with it the undeniable weight of federal authority. I have in my hand a sworn affidavit from Preacher Collins and a full confession from Councilman Miller. By the authority of the United States government and the territory of Montana, I am here to inform you that the warrant for your arrest has been rescinded. The charges against you have been dropped. You are a free man. The words seemed to hang in the frozen air. Impossible, miraculous. Free. Clara felt a sob of pure relief escape her lips. She turned to Wes, her face alight with a joy so fierce it was painful. She saw him staring at the marshal, his face utterly blank, as if he could not comprehend the words he had just heard. He took a staggering step back, his hand coming up to brace himself against the wall. The rifle slipped from his grasp and clattered to the floor. For years, his body had been coiled like a spring, tensed for a fight, for flight, for the final, fatal blow. He had lived with a weight on his soul so heavy it had become a part of him. And now, in an instant, that weight was gone. The spring did not uncoil, it simply broke. His legs buckled beneath him, and he collapsed. Not in a faint, but in a slow, boneless heap, as if the very skeleton that had held him upright for so long had finally dissolved. Clara was there before he hit the floor, catching him, her arms wrapping around his shuddering frame. He buried his face in her shoulder, and she felt the hot, wet tears of a man who had forgotten how to cry. She held him, her own tears flowing freely, her whispers a soothing balm against the raw, open wound of his past. It was into this sacred, private moment that two more riders arrived, the posse, with the sheriff at its head, looking sullen and defeated, and behind them, a man in a fine, expensive coat, his face a mask of cold fury, Governor Thompson. He had come to oversee the capture of the outlaw and the retrieval of his daughter, but he had arrived too late. He stared at the scene before him. His daughter, his prize, his pawn, cradling a free man in her arms, with the full authority of the law protecting them. The marshal turned his horse to face him. "Governor," he said, his voice laced with ice, "it seems your business here is concluded. I suggest you return to the capital. There are some who might be very interested to hear about your attempts to obstruct a federal investigation and coerce a witness." The governor's face went pale. He looked at Clara, his eyes filled with a venomous rage, but for the first time, she felt no fear. She met his gaze, her own eyes clear and steady, and in that moment, he knew he had lost. He was no longer her jailer. He was just a small, ambitious man who had been defeated by a love he could never comprehend. Without a word, he turned his horse and rode away, swallowed by the storm. A man publicly shamed, his power broken. The spring thaw came slowly. Then, all at once, the world, for so long a silent study in white and gray, exploded into life. The sound of dripping water was a constant, gentle music, the icicles on the eaves of the cabin weeping away the last of the winter. The river, once a solid ribbon of ice, broke free with a roar, its waters running high and fast. The air grew soft, filled with the scent of damp earth and pine. On the forest floor, the first green shoots of new life pushed their way through the melting snow. And as the world was reborn, so were they. Wes, cleared of all charges, was a quiet, changed man. The bitterness in his eyes was gone, replaced by a deep, abiding peace. He and Clara worked side by side, equals in every way, to rebuild the part of the cabin the fire had claimed. They felled trees together, hewed the logs, and chinked the walls with fresh mud and moss. It was hard, satisfying work, the steady rhythm of the axe and the saw a kind of therapy, a building of a future with their own two hands. They were not just repairing a home, they were healing a history. One bright afternoon, when the last of the icicles were dripping their final tears from the eaves, they were married. There was no church, no crowd of guests. Their cathedral was the great, silent expanse of the mountains. The pines, their witnesses. The preacher, his face etched with a humility he had not possessed before, came out from town to bless their union, his voice quiet but firm, a final atonement for his years of silence. Clara wore a simple dress of pale blue cotton, her hair unbound, and Wes wore the mended shirt she had sewn for him so long ago. They stood before the preacher, their hands clasped, and spoke the simple, timeless vows that bound their souls together. That night, as the last few snowflakes of the season drifted down like a final, gentle blessing, they stood outside the cabin. The air was cool and clean, filled with the promise of the coming spring. Clara leaned her head against Wes's chest, her arms wrapped around his waist. He was solid, real, hers. She pressed a soft kiss to the rough wood of the cabin wall, the very spot where a desperate, frozen bride had collapsed into the arms of a haunted stranger. She looked up at him, her eyes shining in the twilight. "I need you tonight, tomorrow, and always," she whispered. He smiled, a slow, genuine smile that reached all the way to his clear, gray eyes. He leaned down and kissed her, a kiss not of desperation or hunger, but of deep, quiet, and everlasting love. They stood there for a long time, two outcasts who had found their home, their lips meeting at the cabin wall where it had all begun, no longer frozen, but alive with a fire that would warm them for all the seasons to come. Thank you for listening to our story tonight around the campfire. We would love for you to comment where you are listening from so we can all connect. And be sure to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts.